Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to hear this talk. And I'd like to thank Alexis McCrossan and the other members of the history department at SMU for bringing me here for my first visit, and it's been wonderful. 150 years ago this December, a group of South Carolina politicians did something they had been trying to do for years. They called a convention of the people and voted themselves out of the Union. Within weeks, 6 more states in the Deep South had joined them in their bid for national independence. Theirs was a massive gamble, and as we know, it changed the course of history. Standing on the brink of war, no one in the American South could have known what lay ahead. The scale of war, the demands of waging it, the level of mobilization it would require, the dominion of death it ushered in. All this was unimaginable in 1860. Still, Southerners knew it was a dangerous, even reckless undertaking. So especially now, as we approach the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, I think there is one question above all that we must ask and answer. Why did they risk it? It's not enough to stop at abstract questions about the constitutionality of secession. Far more pressing is the matter of why they insisted on exercising that claimed right. What was wrong with the original republic? What kind of country did secessionists want to build? You have to start there, I think, to grasp the nature of the reckoning that came after, when the new Southern nation was plunged into war. The history of the Confederate States of America is an epic story of ambition and failure. And one of the most gripping parts is the way war tested the Confederacy from within as well as without. For in terms of the practicality and justice of its national ambitions, the CSA was subject to the judgment of its own people, even as it attempted to survive the military test it faced from the Union Army. That many of those people were from the vast ranks of the politically dispossessed in the Civil War South. Poor white rural women and enslaved men and women never consulted about the wisdom of secession and war. That shows the profound poverty of the founders' vision of the people and the challenges of writing its history. The history of the Confederacy is also a bigger story than has often been appreciated, and it takes a broad international perspective and some unorthodox historical methods to tell it. In terms of causes, dynamics, and consequences, it was part of a far larger struggle being waged in the Western world over the future of slavery, democracy, and the powers of nation-states. Confederates were fully caught up in the turbulent currents of history that roiled the hemisphere in the age of emancipation. Whatever the outcome, the political and military failure of Southern slaveholders' bid for independence would register profoundly, not just in the region, but in the nation and, in fact, in the world. Slaveholders in Cuba and Brazil, as well as advocates of abolition everywhere, attended closely to the result of what went down in the Confederate South. The short-lived Confederate States of America was a signal event in the history of the Western world. What secessionists set out to build was something entirely new in the history of nations: a modern, pro-slavery, and anti-democratic state dedicated to the proposition that all men were not, in fact, created equal. Southerners acted out of confidence. No other class of slaveholders in the hemisphere attempted it. Emboldened by what they saw as the failure of emancipation in other parts of the world, convinced that the American vision of the people had been terribly betrayed, Southern slaveholders sought the kind of future for human slavery and republican government no longer possible within the original Union. Although they would later explain it differently, secessionists were bracingly candid in time and place about why the Southern states were leaving the Union, that is to say, about the causes of the Civil War. They made their motives plain, not just in formal declarations, but in the long battle for the hearts and minds of the Southern people that preceded and produced independence. Because secession wasn't just an idea or a political argument, it was a political campaign, a hard-fought and downright dirty political campaign that went on for more than a year and turned on building support among the majority of Southern voters, men who mostly owned no slaves. If there was ever a time to deny that the interests of slaveholders were driving secession, surely this was it. But to the contrary, secessionists made the need to defend slavery the very centerpiece of their appeal. In the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's election in November 1860, the first of a Republican Party candidate and also the first elected entirely by Northern votes, advocates of secession, in South Carolina they called them fire eaters, moved to bring disunion before the vote of the people. Theirs was a political campaign as sophisticated as any in modern history, and it used every means available, not short of fraud and violence, to make the case for radical action. To be sure, secessionists insisted that Southerners' constitutional rights had been violated, but they also made no bones about which rights those were. Indeed, popular appeals emphasized the deep and vital interests of every man, non-slaveholder as well as slaveholder, in the maintenance of slavery and the political independence of the South. One pamphlet, bluntly titled, quote, "The Interest in Slavery of the Southern Non-Slaveholder," sort of bottom-lining it, reminded non-slaveholders, quote, "of the particular value and dignity of white man's labor in slave society. No white man at the South serves another as a body servant to clean his boots, wait on his table, and perform the menial services of his household. His blood revolts against it, and his necessities would never drive him to it." To that set of talking points, fire eaters routinely added even more blatantly demagogic appeals designed to stir up poor white men's racial and sexual fears about slave emancipation. "Where are the white non-slaveholders of Haiti?" the South Carolinian John Townsend asked, conjuring up a future of racial war, rape, and extermination or amalgamation under the coming, as they put it, black Republican regime. They could make it seem as if the very future of all white men, free men as they invariably put it, and not just slaveholders, was at stake in secession. By February 1861, fire eaters had triumphed in 7 Deep South states, some by incredibly slim margins, and in one, Georgia, probably by fraud. There, the governor refused to publish the results of the secession convention elections as required by law, and later, after the convention was already sitting, he cooked the numbers to make it look like they had achieved a slim majority. As printed ordinances of secession hit the streets and Southerners trumpeted their independence to the world, those states also offered formal justifications of their actions, as indeed Jefferson had in the Declaration of Independence. In their declaration of the causes that justify secession, for example, Mississippi said bluntly, quote, that our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. With a northern majority now advocating Negro equality, we have no choice but to submit to the loss of our property worth $4 billion or secede from the Union. President Davis and Southern leaders would later deny it, but at the time, nobody tried to obscure the fact that the protection of slavery was the main cause of secession. They had a right to defend their property in slaves, secessionists said clearly in 1860, against a federal government and a new black Republican regime pledged to abolish it. In March 1861, the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, offered a political manifesto for the slaveholders' new republic. Training his sights on the Upper South, and especially Virginia, still refusing to secede, he offered a blunt assessment of the difference between the old Union and the new. This is a quote. "The original American Republic rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races," Stephens explained, "but our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based on this great truth." When representatives of the new nation sat down in Montgomery to write their constitution, pro-slavery proposals were rendered concrete. They purged the document of the euphemisms adopted in the original U.S. Constitution, brazenly using the term slaves instead of other persons in writing their versions of the 3/5 Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause, and binding both the Congress and the territorial government to recognize and protect, quote, the institution of Negro slavery. They also guaranteed citizens the right of sojourn and transit in any state and territory with their slaves and other property. Confederates, in other words, aimed at empire, and the empire they aimed at was just west of here. But the centerpiece of the Confederate Constitution, the clause that upends any attempt to cast it simply as the copy of the U.S. one, which you hear a lot, that the Confederate Constitution was exactly the same as the U.S. one, but just in case that was the case, they wrote a wholly new clause which prohibited the new government from ever changing the law of slavery. Quote, no bill of attainder or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall ever be passed. Thus they moved to make slavery permanent and to dispense with all of the agitating issues about slavery and representation that had plagued American political life in the antebellum period. But founders also seized the opportunity to limit democracy in other ways, moving to spell out and fix its racial basis. As each Confederate state wrote a new state constitution, they explicitly restricted the right to vote and hold office to white men born or naturalized in the United States. But Alabama went further by allowing all white male residents, including foreign nationals and non-citizens, to vote. Quote, let there be but two classes of persons here, the white and the black. Keep all the white men politically equal, the superior race. Let the Negro be subordinate, and our government will be strong and our liberties secure. In Alabama, race mattered more even than nationality and citizenship. The racial and gender boundaries of Confederate democracy were abundantly clear. They always felt they had to explain the racial basis, but they didn't even have to explain the gender exclusions. Very telling. Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders would later cast secession as a wholly constitutional move designed simply to restore government to what the Founding Fathers had intended. Davis enshrined that version of the South's motives in his memoirs, and it became a staple of the mythology of the lost cause. The goal of secession, he said, was merely to protect the rights of sovereign states from tremendous and sweeping usurpation by the federal government, he wrote in the 1880s. The existence of African servitude was in no way the cause of the conflict, but only an incident. All too many historians have fallen for this pitch. Quote, Confederates did not believe they needed to make new worlds, Emory Thomas famously said. They were more than content with the world they already had, which makes no sense at all. If they were perfectly content with it, they should have just stayed in it. But this could not be more wrong. In falling for the lost cause argument, historians have lost sight of the true nature of what Confederates attempted to do at such incredible risk of blood and treasure, to build an explicitly pro-slavery nation. Theirs was a country that defended slavery, rejected democracy, and scorned the Declaration of Independence. It rejected most of the principles that Americans value most highly. Secession was the South's big gamble on the future of slavery. They didn't have to do it. Southerners could have played a wait-and-see game, as many Unionists advised. But for those mostly Deep South men who orchestrated secession in the fall and winter of 1861, the election of Abraham Lincoln presented a risky but desperately sought opportunity to bring the crisis of slavery to a head. With secession, they went all in. With war came the reckoning. It's hard to exaggerate the drama of what ensued in the Confederacy once the founders were free to pursue their dream of a slaveholder state. Once war began, the South's pro-slavery and anti-democratic experiment was tried and found wanting, not just by the enemy armies arrayed against it, but by the very people, the slaves and white women, the founders had counted out. The Confederacy faced a political as well as a military testing. It could hardly have been otherwise. It had been difficult enough to convince the South's white men to support secession. In some Southern, even Deep South states, commitments to unionism ran so deep it took substantial manipulation of the electoral system to produce slim majorities for secession. Nowhere in the Deep South were ordinances of secession submitted for popular ratification, and in the Upper South, only war and Lincoln's call for troops broke the impasse, and even then 4 slave states chose union. But as it turned out, there were far more of the people to contend with in the making of history in the Civil War South than the white men who cast their votes for or against disunion in 1860 and 61. As the founders faced the task of building a new nation, the demands on the people escalated alarmingly. Out of a total population of about 10 million in the Confederate States, fewer than 1.5 million, the number of white male voters, had ever had a say about secession. Those are the people politicians meant when they talked about the consent of the governed. But if it took only 1/6 of the population to create the Confederacy, it would have required all 10 million to secure its survival. The Confederacy's experiment in nation-making thus involved a reckoning with the political will of all of the Southern people, including the mass of unfranchised women and slaves. Confederates' original vision of the people proved utterly inadequate to the nation-building project launched in 1861, as the chrysalis state confronted and attempted to surmount the structural problems faced by a slave regime at war. War immeasurably upped the ante in the white man's new republic. As the new government turned to its white citizens to support and defend the bid for national independence, it faced the necessity of building support among those whose consent had never been secured, and then began a relentless process in which government officials and military men all the way up the chain of command scrambled to execute policies designed to build a state and wage war, while preserving slavery and feeding and protecting a civilian population increasingly denied the support of their men. In mobilizing for war, the CSA faced a number of political challenges particular to slave regimes. Chief among them was the way the institution of slavery limited the power of the federal government and compromised its sovereignty. As Jefferson Davis once said, slavery was a form of government for those not fit to govern themselves. Slavery was the slave state, masters the authority to whom they owed allegiance. What that meant in practice was that slaves had no standing in relation to the state, they owed it no allegiance, and they could be accessed by the state only as the property of their masters. So that left considerable power in the hands of the masters themselves, establishing slaveholders as a competing source of authority to the government and limiting the number of men the government could call on for the defense of the state. In both respects, the government would suffer as it tried to mobilize for war. A state that could not claim the allegiance of a big section of its adult male population faced inherent dangers, ones exacerbated, of course, by war. At one level, the problem was pretty obvious. The Confederacy had an economy and population a fraction the size of its enemy. The North had 10 times the South's manufacturing capacity. The South's population of 10 million was dwarfed by the Union's 22 million. But even that understates the problem, for of course, in addition, 40% of the adult men in the Confederacy were enslaved and thus unavailable for military service. It quickly became clear what such imbalances meant. The South would have to exert unprecedented and insupportable demands on its population, and ironically, it would have to build up a powerful central state government to do what the private sector could not. The increasingly intimate and coercive relations between private individuals and government agents was profoundly disorienting to people accustomed to little government interference in their lives. The new powers claimed by the federal government challenged slaveholders' usual paramount authority over their property and posed tests of their nationalism. Many of them failed. But for slaves and white women, people in whom the government had expressed no previous interest, whom it had been content to leave to the government of husbands and masters, for those people, the war was more than a test of political moments. It was a profoundly transformative event. For them, the Confederate War was a moment when time itself opened up and they could step into the making of history. By 1862, the process of desperate innovation was already well advanced, and the Davis administration driven to adopt the first Conscription Act in American history. When all was said and done, Confederate armies would enlist a staggering 75 to 85% of the white military-age population. To say it tested the limits of popular support for war is an understatement. When combined with exceptions the government was forced to make for slaveholders, including the exemption of one white man for every 20 Negroes on a plantation, and the decision to allow the purchase of substitutes, conscription quickly raised cries of rich man's war, poor man's fight. But it soon became the women's fight as well. For as the Confederate government began to face the challenge posed by Unionist guerrillas, draft evaders, and deserters, they found themselves fighting not just the men but the women, including the wives, mothers, and daughters who defied the state's authority to conscript and undermined its capacity to wage war. As army units went out to hunt deserters, governors issued orders authorizing the arrest of parties of, quote, any age and sex. And federal judges urged that, quote, the women and non-combatants be handed speedily and roughly. Against them, one advised, the most radical and severe treatment is required. They had to go after the women because they couldn't find the men, right? They weren't at home where they were looking for them. As the military pursued a harsh, even brutal policy on the ground, accounts began to pour in of poor white women intimidated, beaten, even tortured for information on the whereabouts of their menfolk. The horrifying scenes in the novel and the movie Cold Mountain are just retellings of historical documents. I've read them. They're in the North Carolina archives. And he's literally describing things that happened in the mountains of North Carolina. Coupled with the growing number of arrests of women spies and members of Unionist guerrilla bands, especially in the border states, the recognition that women were capable of treason and that the government would have to punish their treason led Confederate officials into what some bluntly called, quote, a war against the women. The old image of Antigone, the idea of women as outside war, in the realm of the family and not the state, was as nothing then. And behind it all lay a wholly new estimation of women's political significance and a new view of women's standing in relation to the state. Nobody expected to hold women accountable for treason when the war started. It never even occurred to them that women could act in treasonous ways. But if the Confederate government was forced to contend with the women in their new individual capacity as traders, they faced another, I think, more daunting political challenge from the mass of white Southern women in their new collective identity as soldiers' wives. The South was an agrarian society, whole regions of it populated by yeomen and poor white families. There had never been any expectation that these women could make subsistence on those farms without the labor of men, and indeed they could not. By 1863, with husbands and sons in the war and the countryside literally stripped of men, as they put it, the food crisis in the Confederacy reached starvation proportions. At that point, it turned into a policy crisis provoked by women who mobilized to insist on the fulfillment of promises made to them by government officials and politicians when it took their men. This politics of subsistence, as I think of it, and the new political class of soldiers' wives who made it, was one entirely unanticipated element of the Confederate reckoning war had brought. For more than a year, poor white soldiers' wives besieged state and federal officials with their warnings about the consequences of a military policy geared towards the interests of the big men, as they always put it. In increasingly radical and threatening language, they demanded not just individual release, say the release of their husband from the army, but justice, in fact, for the Confederate poor. And they also spoke increasingly in a collective voice. We soldiers' wives, we poor people. And they increasingly targeted policy, demanding revision of conscription and tax laws. All of this evidence of poor white women's new politics has been there all along, moldering in the archives, in those boxes, just waiting for us to come and open them up. We have missed it. But nobody, believe me, missed what happened next. In the spring of 1863, soldiers' wives took direct action in a wave of spectacular food riots that hit the South from Mobile to Richmond. Mobs of women numbering from a dozen to more than 300 and armed with Navy revolvers, pistols, repeaters, Bowie knives, and hatchets carried out at least 12 violent attacks on stores, there are rumors of more, on stores, government warehouses, army convoys, railroad depots, saltworks, and granaries. The attacks occurred in broad daylight, and they were all perpetrated in the space of 1 month between the middle of March and the middle of April 1863. Conspiracy theories abounded. This must be the work of men, Yankee operatives, the Southern newspapers said. In most cases, we don't know how the riots were organized, but in Richmond, the biggest, we know. And as it turns out, it wasn't the work of men, but of one Mary Jackson, soldier's mother, farm wife, and huckster in meat at the public market. She had tried to solve her problems through proper channels with appeals to the Secretary of War to release her son from service. Hers is just one of the thousands of the angry, threatening, half-literate letters written to government officials by soldiers' wives and mothers over the course of the war. These riots have a deep backstory, one we have not often told. It was simply the most dramatic manifestation of the new political realities at work in rural and urban communities all over the South, what I call soldiers' wives' politics of subsistence. Most women never crossed the line between protest and direct action. They just sent the letters. But when Mary Jackson got no satisfaction, she recruited 300 town and country women to a meeting at the Belvedere Baptist Church in Richmond, got up into the pulpit to rally her troops, told them to gather the next morning at the entrance to Capitol Square, to leave their children at home, and to come armed. It was truly a Confederate spring of soldiers' wives' discontent. The women made themselves count. The wave of food riots had a measurable impact on Confederate war policy, forcing revisions of conscription and tax policy. But its greatest effect was that it prompted the development of a massive welfare program by the states that in allocating scarce funds and foodstuffs to the relief of soldiers' wives and children dwarfed anything undertaken in the North. And given the state of the Confederate Treasury, or state treasuries by that point, you can tell that it was a political priority to get the guns off these women because they didn't have a lot of money to throw around. In the heart of Confederate national territory, the mass of white Southern women had emerged as formidable adversaries of the government in the long struggle over the justice of its military policies. By insisting that the state live up to its promises to support them, even taking up arms to do so, these poor white women who had never participated in politics before stepped decisively into the making of history. What are we to make of this? Their politics are not easily read through our lexicon of women's concerns. They certainly didn't speak a language of rights. They didn't talk about women's rights. They didn't talk about citizens' rights. So while it's tempting to cast this history of Confederate women as an episode in the history of citizenship in the United States, I think there is reason to entertain a less predictable view. For the mobilization of poor, mostly rural women in the Confederate South during the Civil War bears resemblance not so much to the process of gradual extension of citizenship around which most American political history is framed, the liberalism framework, but far more, I think, to the way politics was practiced by poor rural and urban people in many other parts of the world, what one historian has called the politics of the governed in most of the world. If the new political assertiveness of Southern women didn't bring down the Confederacy, it did represent a powerful challenge to the Confederate vision of the people and the Republic, and it certainly showed the limits of their pro-slavery and anti-democratic nationalism. Any state that took their men would ultimately have to answer to them. The reckoning with slaves politics was even more direct and consequential. At the birth of the Republic, Thomas Jefferson had warned that slavery destroyed slaves' love of country and made them allies of any foreign power that countenanced their emancipation. Slavery, he predicted, turned slaves into enemies and nurtured traitors at the American breast. Secessionists seemed heedless of the dangers, gave no thought to what slaves would do, discounted entirely the matter of slaves' allegiance. But moving decisively to grasp the opening history offered in their own long war against the slaveholders, slaves made their loyalties and allegiance count and created a significant problem of treason in the Confederacy. The problem was evident first to masters on plantations who as early as January 1861 found evidence of sedition, as one put it, as well as powder and guns in the quarters, insurrectionary plots, and networks of slave communication providing valuable intelligence to the enemy. Indeed, the plantation emerged as a crucial site of Civil War politics because it grounded a struggle that radiated up and out through the various levels of government in the Confederacy. Slaves moved tactically and by stages, men and women both, equal and active participants in the whole array of insurrectionary activities calculated to destroy the institution of slavery, their master's power, and the prospects of the Confederacy as a pro-slavery nation. Excluded from political life as a matter of foundational principle, slaves' politics registered profoundly nonetheless, not just in Union policy, where we have been trained to look, but in Confederate policy, as state and federal officials attempted to make slaves' labor count for the cause. Slaves' activities had crucial consequences not just for owners, but for the Confederate government and military as well. Confederate politicians had begun the war boasting of slaves as an element of strength. That was a phrase they used again and again. We can fight this war easily because slaves are an element of strength. But when they demanded the labor of male slaves to support the army, a policy called impressment, the government and military soon found themselves in a losing conflict with slaveholders unwilling to surrender valuable but openly rebellious property. Even as the government attempted to draw on slave property to sustain the war, slave owners attempted to draw on the state to protect slave property from the war. Indeed, many saw the army as nothing less than a giant slave patrol and complained bitterly when Confederate military men exposed their property to the enemy. Is not the protection of property one of the duties of an army in the field? One Virginia slaveholder wrote his congressman, demanding that the army position itself so as to stop the flow of slaves to Union lines in his area near Newport News, Virginia. Taken as a class, slaveholders proved spectacularly unwilling to sacrifice property for nation. In the Confederacy, as in other slaveholding societies at war, slaveholding appeared to have the effect of attenuating national loyalty. The planter is more ready to contribute his sons and his slaves to the war, the Mobile Register declared. You cheerfully yield your children to the country. How refuse your servants? One broadside blasted. And perhaps there's nothing surprising about that in a country founded explicitly for the protection of property and slaves. And given the protections to slave property written into the Constitution, there was little the federal government could do to compel compliance from individual slaveholders. Planters colluded with their slaves in thwarting impressment. They told them to run into the woods, to duck when the agents came to pick them up. Slaveholders took oaths of allegiance and occupied territory in order to hold on to their property. They attacked military commanders who didn't make a priority of their interests in shaping military strategy, and they demanded that local and state politicians represent their interests against the demands of the War Department. For some slaveholders, any state would do, Confederate, Union, Brazilian, as long as it protected their property and slaves. Like their counterparts in other slave societies, Confederate slaveholders often proved to be more concerned with property than nation. Do historians' robust assertions of the strength and endurance of Confederate nationalism take that into account? How else are we to explain the actions of a group reckless enough to take a region and all its people into a perilous war, but not patriotic enough to do what it took to fight it? But if slaveholders could prove a weak link in the Confederacy, even bigger resistance came from the slaves themselves. Enslaved men resisted impressment for a variety of very good reasons. It forced separation of their families, withdrew their labor from their dependent support, and exposed them to significant threat of disease. But Confederate military men knew they also resisted for political reasons. One engineer in charge of building defensive works in Northern Virginia said bluntly that, quote, slaves, quote, refuse to do labor that will thwart the Federals, who they look upon as fighting for their freedom. In seizing every chance to run away from the works, often straight to the enemy, with the works, the enemy was always nearby, the property insisted on acting as persons who saw the war as a critical moment in their own political history and long war against slavery. The mix of compromised state sovereignty and slaves' resistance created intractable problems for military commanders. They knew that slaves posed a danger to their operations, but they couldn't pursue them as they would other persons caught providing aid and comfort to the enemy. It is surely revealing that the best descriptions of slaves' anti-Confederate activities come from Confederate military men who paid the price of their disloyalty and, heedless of the complications, bluntly called them traitors and enemies who posed a threat to the existence of the Confederate Republic. The dilemma came to a head early on in Pensacola Harbor in March 1862, when a Confederate officer initiated a court-martial of 6 slave men caught escaping to the enemy at Fort Pickens. The charges, quote, attempt to violate the 57th Article of War, holding correspondence with or giving intelligence to the enemy. Who ever heard of a Negro slave being arraigned before a court-martial for a violation of the Articles of War their incredulous master railed? Who indeed? In charging slaves with treason, the officer posed profound questions about their political status and membership in the polity. Did slaves owe allegiance to the nation? Remember what the definition of treason is, violating a loyalty that's owed to the state. Did slaves owe allegiance to the nation, the state to start with? Could they be traitors? Were they subject to military law? Those questions reverberated all the way up the chain of command to the office of the Secretary of War. They were never resolved. Indeed, what resolution was possible? Confederate commanders had to be able to recognize slaves as traitors, if only to contain the damage they posed to the military. But how could that be adopted as official policy without profound damage to the status of slaves as property, whose only allegiance was to their masters? If slaves were traitors, clearly they were no longer just slaves. But the kinds of transformation the Pensacola officer had acknowledged, slaves as traitors and therefore as persons, these were irreversible, and they had profound ramifications in the Confederacy, as the need to harness slaves' labor relentlessly pressed a recognition of the only terms on which slaves would be willing to deliver it. It's now a familiar part of the narrative of the American Civil War, how slaves' actions transformed a war for union into a war for emancipation. Less well known is how 4 million slaves' resistance to the pro-slavery agenda of the Confederate government pushed it down its own reluctant path to slave enlistment, recapitulating elements of a struggle that had unfolded across the hemisphere since the American and French Revolutions. None of the plans adopted ever reached the scale of that proposed by Major General Patrick Claiborne of the Army of Tennessee, who in December 1863, this is a guy who had been pushed back all the way from the top of the Mississippi River at Forts Henry and Dawlinsville all the way down through Shiloh, and was in northern Georgia with the Army of Tennessee wintering and sitting there contemplating, where can we get more men? What can we do? And he wrote a long treatise on the challenges facing the Confederate Army. And he made a proposal. This guy was amazing. He actually assembled all the commanders of the Army of Tennessee and read it before them. And it was the most radical thing you've ever heard. And let's just say he never got another promotion ever again after that. But he wrote this document that made clear the stern logic of events in a slave regime at war. It was as blunt an assessment of the damage slaves were wreaking on the Confederate military as one will ever read. It makes me sound like I'm downplaying the problem. We are waging war with the enemy in front and an insurrection in the rear, he said. The biggest weakness facing this army is slavery. And he urged Davis to confront the problem of slaves' allegiance and do what he had to do to earn their loyalty for the Confederacy. That's sort of a tall order, don't you think? His most shocking contention was not that the Confederacy should use slave men as soldiers to replenish its armies, although that is what he said, but that it could be accomplished only by recognizing slaves' own political desires and objectives in the war. Quote, "We must bind him to our cause by no doubtful bonds," he advised, and the only bond sufficient was the hope of freedom. It would be preposterous to expect him to fight against it with any degree of enthusiasm. When we make soldiers of them, we must make freemen of them beyond all question. Thus did slave emancipation arise in Confederate history, as in so many other cases before and after, as a military imperative. In fact, one of the things I think we have completely underestimated is the relationship of war and emancipation in Western history. By a long, circuitous route, President Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee eventually were forced to contend, as Claiborne had, with the humanity and politics of the slaves, whose status as property they had succeeded to secure into perpetuity. By 1864 and 65, officials in the highest reaches of the Confederate government were forced to try to win slaves over to the cause because they so desperately needed their military service. Incredible as it might seem, they wanted to enlist slaves as soldiers. Even then, with national survival at stake, very few were prepared to entertain emancipation as the terms of service, as Claiborne insisted they had. That was part of the reason he was frozen out. In a tightly controlled, top-down way that included the public solicitation of General Lee's support, President Davis, Secretary of State Judah Benjamin, and Virginia Governor William Smith struggled, but mostly failed, to gain the support of the public and of Congress for the use of slaves in the Confederate Army. Congress did, screaming and dragging its feet until March 1865, eventually pass a law allowing the use of slave men in the Army, but explicitly stating that the law, quote, did nothing to authorize a change in the relation which the said slaves bear to their owners. The Congress, in other words, proposed to enlist still enslaved men as soldiers in the Confederate Army. They refused, even at the 11th hour, to write an emancipation clause. This is not actually what you hear on the internet or in Virginia fourth grade textbooks, as the Washington Post pointed out last week, but I tell you this as actually the case. The War Department did write orders requiring that slave men could serve only by their own consent. And if you think about that, that effectively cancels the property status of slaves. It ascribes to them the human will that they were supposedly devoid of as property. So the War Department wrote orders requiring that slave men could serve only by their own consent and with free papers from their masters. But by late March, desperate for men to hold the lines outside Richmond and Petersburg, even Davis dispensed with the requirement of consent and manumission and called on the governor of Virginia to draft all black men, slave and free, between the ages of 18 and 45 for service as soldiers. In the last desperate days of the war, 2 companies of black soldiers were raised and drilled on the streets of Richmond, dispatched to fight on the fortifications in front of Petersburg. Little remains by which we might ascertain their status. We don't know whether they fought as free men or as slaves. Most of them were already impressed to the Union Army as orderlies at Winder Hospital in Richmond. It wasn't exactly like they went out and recruited black men to the Confederate Army. The Confederate Congress and the Virginia legislature refused to the bitter end to condone the emancipation of any slave men who served. The story of arming slaves and how Confederates arrived at that juncture is surely the most dramatic kind of reckoning white Southerners had brought on themselves with that war. It is also one potent measure of the political incoherence their national project had come to by the end of the war. Davis and his cabinet had been forced to do the unthinkable: undermine owners' paramount claim to their property and move to enlist slave men to save the slaveholders' republic. That episode hardly suggests that Confederates chose independence over slavery, as so many people, including professional historians, continue to insist. It is rather a profound indication of the structural problems the Confederacy had always faced as a slave regime at war, and it is the ultimate measure of what slaves wrought in Confederate political life. The Confederate States of America was transformed by war, and the Confederate political project was undone by the very people who had been taken for ciphers in it. Military defeat was coupled with political failure. Given the pro-slavery and anti-democratic aspirations of that government, there was a certain justice in that. By April 1865, the Confederacy was in ruins. A nation founded in a risky bid to render slavery in the power of American slaveholders permanent had failed spectacularly, bringing down the most powerful slave regime in the Western world. To say it changed the course of history is not to say too much. As we approach the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, it seems especially important for us to go back to that moment in time when the Confederate experiment was launched and take a hard look at what Southerners' case for secession actually portended. What kind of country did they hope to build? And what kind of country would have resulted if they had been allowed to go peacefully in 1861 or had somehow succeeded in war? Ironically, it's unlikely that in December 1860 anyone in the North or South could have imagined a scenario in which within 4 years Southerners would face the total, immediate, and uncompensated emancipation of 4 million slaves. Even as late as December 1862, President Lincoln proposed an amendment that would have extended the life of the institution to 1900. But in seceding to secure the future of slavery, Southerners created arguably the only set of conditions, war-born and state-sponsored emancipation, under which slavery could be fully and immediately destroyed as an institution of American life. They gambled, and they lost. Had the Confederacy succeeded, or had the war ceased with anything short of total defeat and unnegotiated surrender, African American Southerners would have faced generations more of enslavement, with all of the horrific assaults on their personal safety, family integrity, human rights, and dignity that institution guaranteed. When we remember the war and talk about its causes, we ought to remember that. And I think we should count ourselves lucky that we were spared the future the Confederacy promised. In 1860 and thereafter, secessionists claimed to be engaged in a strictly constitutional and restorationist project, an attempt to exercise a right to secession to reclaim the Republic as the founders had bequeathed it to them. It's an argument that echoes dangerously in our own time. But that version of the cause obscures the radical nature of what Confederates attempted to do. For in seceding to perfect the Republic, they in fact set out to make one that had never existed before in the United States, a republic shorn of the compromises, hedges, and increasingly violent divisions over the legitimacy of human bondage that had in fact defined the Republic since the founding. What they set out to make was an explicitly pro-slavery country, and that had never existed before. Secessionists' constitutional and restorationist claims obscured radical new ends. Surely there is a warning for us in that, in the dangers of asserting a right that is sure to be contested, as I gather your governor periodically does, and harking back to an ideal and ideally conservative republic that in fact never existed at all. As we begin our 5 years of national commemoration, we ought to keep that in mind, to push beyond arguments about constitutional rights and ask the more important question about what kind of future secession and the Confederate States of America promised. Thank you.